Hello, and welcome everyone to today's latest and greatest Illuma webinar. Today, we have one of my favorite people coming and giving us a presentation that should not be missed. Love to welcome back Dr. John Kelly, who will be presenting on student behavior decoded, recognizing signs of distress in K-12 school settings. For those of you who don't know, my name is George Dayton, and I work with Illuma. Our agenda for today is we are going to just do a brief introduction. I don't think we'll probably even take 5 minutes, and that will allow John to jump into the meat of his presentation, which should be about 45 minutes or so. And at the end, should we have time, we're going to have a Q&A session and we'll have some discussion. And we welcome you all to participate in this. And so you'll note that there is a chat feature at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom menu. Feel free to chime in with thoughts and questions and feelings, and then we'll revisit those things at the very end of the presentation. And again, we encourage you to do so. One quick reminder for everyone else is that we do have closed captioning on this. And so should you need captions, we invite you to do that, use that feature, and you can access that again at the bottom of your Zoom screen on the menu, and just go to captions and activate that. And then moving on, we want to just tell you a little bit about who we are. I presume some of you have been to some of the Illuma webinars, but if you haven't, we are Illuma, and we have been in business for about 11 years, and our goal is working to help all students achieve their potential. Primarily and historically, our focus has been on mental health and related services, and we work with schools and districts all over the country to help shore up the gap with clinicians and services. To date, we've served over 40,000 students and have delivered over 525,000 hours of therapy. So I'd like to think we're getting pretty good at what we do. But we love what we do, and we love making a difference in the lives of students. And invite any of you out there who should need help with any of these things to reach out to speak to one of the members of our team. We can give you a brief demo and an explanation of what we do, how we do it, and how we can help you. Just a few things about today's webinar. Again, part of what we're doing is to provide content and thought leadership. This is part of an ongoing webinar series, hopefully to provide support, enlightenment for administrators, teachers, and clinicians alike. And we have all kinds of webinars out there. So we invite you to check us out on our website. You can see the URL there on the page, illuma.com/webinars. You can see our upcoming webinars. And then we also have a page on YouTube where we have dozens and dozens of great kinds of webinars, like we said, for administrators, teachers, and clinicians that include all kinds of things related to related services, mental health, speech therapy, all kinds of good stuff. For those of you that are attending today, we will be sending a link with the slide deck as well as certificate of attendance. These will be sent, and then also a recording of this webinar. So should you want to revisit some of these things, and I suspect you will. John is one of my favorite presenters that we have partnered with. He's down to earth, he's intelligent, he's insightful. So again, I'm guessing that a lot of you will want to come back and revisit this. And last but not least, we encourage participation. So post your questions and comments, your reflections in the chat box. We will monitor, we will respond, and we will come back to them. But without any further ado, let's talk about our host, John Kelly. As I mentioned, he's one of my favorite people. He's recently retired, but I don't think he's any less busy. I know very few individuals that are more passionate about what they do. And John specifically works in the domain of school psychology and student mental health. I can think that there are probably very few people in this country that have done more to promote the cause of student wellness and student well-being and mental health. And so John is a great candidate to present today. You can read his qualifications there. I think most notably, John was a past president of the National Association of School Psychologists, uh, created a huge impact there, but on a local level, he worked in a district as a school psych and did all kinds of good stuff. I'm sure he'll give you some background in the presentation. But I don't want to steal any more time from you, John. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Kelly.
Well, thank you, George. It is a pleasure to be back with you, and certainly Eluma. I absolutely treasure our relationship that we've built over the last few years. And just to give you and the whole Eluma crowd a shout out, bringing these types of webinars, free professional development online is really something that is unheard of in many sectors. And so I just want to just acknowledge and thank you for all the work that you, George, in particular, and Jeremy, your CEO, and the whole crew at Eluma have done over the years to put this type of material out there. But I am happy to be back. I am happy to be back talking about a topic, as George said, that I am very passionate about, talking about the mental health needs of our kids and how we could really meet some of those needs. And I love this webinar, and I have to be honest with you, I kind of love the title about decoding students' behavior or behavior decoded, because I often talk to parents, to teachers, to administrators about there are times where we need to play detective with kids' behaviors. They're not always out there telling us this is what's wrong with me, or this is what's going on in my life, or this is what I'm bothered by. No, oftentimes we're seeing certain behaviors, we're seeing certain things in a classroom, or maybe even in the home environment, and I got to be honest with you. I'm a parent. I have 3 children myself, and we scratching our heads at times, and kind of saying, what's going on here? What's really happening with our children? So what I hope to present today to you is just a little bit of that insight into how do we really begin to look at behavior from a slightly different angle. Now, is this a mission impossible? You know what? I'm going to say at times it's challenging, but I honestly believe no, it's not a mission impossible. Now, one of my favorite movies is Christmas Story. Everyone remembers, the classic Christmas Story, Ralphie, and then his, Red Ryder BB gun that he's waiting to get. But one of my favorite scenes in the entire movie is, Ralphie spends weeks drinking Ovaltine and drinking, getting the boxes of Ovaltine so he can get his magic decoder ring. And when he finally gets that decoder ring, does anybody remember what the secret code was? Well, since we're online, I won't ask you to put in the chat box, but if you want to respond, in the chat box, that's cool. But whoops, I went back too far. Excuse me, 1 second. It was be sure to drink your Ovaltine. So it was a commercial for the Ovaltine for the magic decoder ring that Ralphie got. One thing I'm going to promise you today is I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm not here. This is not a commercial for anything. It's an honest conversation that we're going to have. So no, you won't need your magic decoder ring for this, that oftentimes we think is going to give us all of the answers that we have out there. But what I am going to ask you to do is to keep an open mind about things. Now, there's an important acknowledgement of what I want to start out with, quite honestly. And I want to acknowledge kind of the current situation, the current world, the current times that we're living in within education at this point in time. Just last week, there happened to be an ed chat, one of these Twitter chats that they have online. And the prompt for the ed chat was, is education guilty of mission creep? Is the role of teachers expanding? With limited time and resources, what role should teachers play in meeting the increasing number of mental health and academic needs of our students? Let's chat. And I have to be honest with you, it was a good conversation. It was good online conversations. If you've ever participated in one of these conversations, they can be pretty neat at times. You get really different perspectives from across the country, at times from across the world in many circumstances. But I want to share a couple of my favorite comments that were offered during this particular chat. So this one participant, I love this guy. He was throughout the chat just offering these little quips. But there was a time when so much stuff was being dumped on teachers to deal with. We refer to it as the spandex curriculum. And I thought, okay, this guy's got a good sense of humor. I love where he's going with it. And then later on in the chat, he said, maybe we should define a teacher as an academic, social worker, psychologist, nurse, and student advocate who will work for low pay and often great abuse. And while there's humor in what he is saying and what he's commenting and certainly reflecting upon, it really, for me, got summarized during one of these other comments from another poster who said, I'm afraid that the SEL needs of my students is becoming more than I am trained to help with. Students enter my classroom with years of educational trauma that cannot be undone in one school year. And I got to be honest with you, I stopped and I really reflected upon that. And this is something that we hear from our educators, from our teachers that are in the classroom, from our administrators, even from my fellow mental health professionals that are working within the schools, that there's a lot going on. And what are we really asking educators to do today? Let me say, I'm not going to ask a teacher to be a therapist. I'm not going to ask an administrator to diagnose anyone of any type of mental health condition. No, I think that that's not the role of our classroom teachers, of our administrators. What I'm really asking is, as I said a few moments ago, keep that open mind. Look at things from a slightly different perspective. And I'd like to play this video for you. Some of you may have seen this. It's a fairly famous story that's out there, but it kind of presents looking beyond the surface for me and looking at students from a slightly different perspective. So let's see if the technology will work, and hopefully you'll be able to hear things.
And I'd like to read this to you, if I can do it without tearing up. There's a story many years ago of an elementary school teacher. Her name was Mrs. Thompson. As she stood in front of her 5th grade class on the very first day of school, she told the children a lie. Like most teachers, she looked at her students and said that she loved them all the same. But that was impossible because there in the front row, slumped in his seat, was a little boy named Teddy Stoddard. Mrs. Thompson had watched Teddy the year before and noticed that he didn't play well with the other children, that his clothes were messy, and that he constantly needed a bath. Teddy could be unpleasant. It got to the point where Mrs. Thompson would actually take delight in marking his papers with a broad red pen and making bold X's and then putting a big F at the top of his papers. At the school where Mrs. Thompson taught, she was required to review each child's past records, and she put Teddy's off until last. However, when she reviewed his file, she was in for a surprise. Teddy's 1st grade teacher wrote, "Teddy is a bright child with a ready laugh. He does his work neatly, and he has good manners. He's a joy to be around." His 2nd grade teacher wrote, "Teddy's an excellent student, well liked by his classmates. But he's troubled because his mother has a terminal illness, and life at home must be a struggle." His 3rd grade teacher wrote, "His mother's death has been hard on him. He tries to do his best, but his father doesn't show much interest, and his home life will soon affect him if steps aren't taken." Teddy's 4th grade teacher wrote, "Teddy's withdrawn and doesn't show up much interest in school. He doesn't have many friends, and sometimes he even sleeps in class." By now, Mrs. Thompson realized the problem, and she was ashamed of herself. She felt even worse when her students brought her Christmas presents wrapped in beautiful ribbons and bright paper, except for Teddy's. His present was clumsily wrapped in heavy brown paper that he got from the grocery bag. Mrs. Thompson took pains to open it in the middle of the other presents. Some of the children started to laugh when she found a rhinestone bracelet with some of the stones missing and a bottle that was 1/4 full of perfume. But she stifled her children's laughter when she exclaimed how pretty the bracelet was, putting it on and dabbing some of the perfume on her wrist. Teddy Stoddard stayed after school that day just long enough to say, "Mrs. Thompson, today you smell just like my mom used to." After the children left, she cried for at least an hour. On the very day, she quit teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, and instead, she began to teach children. Mrs. Thompson paid particular attention to Teddy. As she worked with him and his mind seemed to come alive, the more she encouraged him, the faster he responded. By the end of the year, Teddy had become one of the smartest children in the class, and despite her lie, became one of her teacher's pets. A year later, she found a note under the door from Teddy telling her that she was still the best teacher he ever had in his whole life. 6 years went by before she got another note from Teddy. He then wrote that he had finished high school third in his class, and she was still the best teacher he ever had in his whole life. 4 years after that, she got another letter saying that while things had been tough at times, he stayed in school and stuck with it, and would soon graduate from college with the highest of honors. He assured Mrs. Thompson that she was still the very best and favorite teacher he ever had in his whole life. Then 4 more years passed, and yet another letter came. This time he explained that after he got his bachelor's degree, he decided to go a little further. The letter explained that she was still the best and favorite teacher he ever had, but now his name was a little longer. The letter was signed Theodore F. Stoddard, M.D. But the story doesn't end there. You see, there was yet another letter that spring. Teddy said he'd met this girl and was going to be married. He explained that his father had died a couple of years ago, and he was wondering if Mrs. Thompson might agree to sit in the place at the wedding that was usually reserved for the mother of the groom. Of course, Mrs. Thompson did, and guess what? She wore that bracelet, the one with the several rhinestones missing. And she made sure she was wearing the perfume that Teddy remembered his mother wearing on their last Christmas together. They hugged each other, and Dr. Stoddard whispered in Mrs. Thompson's ear, "Thank you so much for making me feel important and showing me that I could make a difference." Mrs. Thompson came with tears in her eyes and whispered back, "Teddy, you have it all wrong. You were the one who taught me that I could make a difference. I didn't know how to teach until I met you."
So when we look beyond the surface, we often discover a lot more about our kids' behavior. We often discover that, in fact, what's beyond that behavior are challenges that really have nothing to do with what's going on in the classroom. And in fact, you're going to hear me say this a couple of times, that really have nothing to do with us as educators. It's not about you as an educator. But when we can understand what's happening with that child, that's when we could truly make a difference in a child's life. And just like our story about Teddy here, there's a lot happening in his life. And to have a teacher who believed in him and who saw beyond that surface behavior became very, very important. So let's kind of dive in a little bit about children's behavior. I'm going to start rather broad in terms of talking about behavior in general, and then kind of narrow it down to talking about distress behavior signs, warning signs, and actually distressed behavior that we might see, and hopefully end on a note where you'll have a sense, in terms of, well, what can you possibly do as an educator? What can you do as a parent to really decode those behaviors? So there's lots of influences in terms of our kids' behavior. We're going to walk through each one of these real briefly. Each one of these, quite honestly, could be a seminar on its own. But things such as the child's age, so developmentally where they're at, temperament, has a lot to do with the way children react to certain situations, and certainly environmental influences that are out there become very, very important. So I think, as we know, kids react differently, and they evolve over time as they progress through different developmental stages. And we experience the world in a different way, depending upon the developmental level or developmental stage that we're really at. So, young children, I mean, think about an infant, or a toddler, and they're really experiencing things in a very sensory way, experiencing things through sights and sounds and tastes. And that's how they really process the information that's coming around them. As they get a little bit older, the preschoolers, they're seeking that independence. It's kind of that, branching away from mom and dad, or branching away from the caregiver, just enough to kind of have a little bit of independence. They're developing those social skills. That's why our preschool programs are often very, very important. It gives that opportunity for kids to socialize. If kids can't be in a kind of formal preschool program, getting them involved in some type of community activities, or community programs really helps them develop those social skills, which are so critical at that age. As they kind of get older, they're refining those problem-solving abilities. They're refining the ability to kind of confront things that are happening in our life. And then the adolescence hit, and this is really truly that transition from that childhood to the adulthood. And I talk about the major life challenge for any teenager is really to develop that sense of identity. Now, while we're developing our sense of identity, we go through lots of different phases. We try different things out. We try different groups to hang out with, or different appearances that we have. We adopt different attitudes that go on. So we could see the age or developmental levels really can impact our behavior in so many different ways. What I think is really critical for educators to recognize is that, what, a lot of this is really age appropriate. Sometimes when you come across behaviors that seem disturbing, or somehow distressed behaviors, the reality is it's more reflective of that life challenge, the developmental challenge that the child is really going through, as opposed to truly distressed behavior. So I think it's really critical for us to kind of keep this in mind, as we look at kids' behavior. As I said, temperament can have a true influence. There are some kids who are just, a little bit quieter, and a little bit more introverted, and kind of happy with themselves, or playing with a small group of friends, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And then others that might have, more of that outgoing personality, and they're kind of more naturally, playing with others, and want to be in large groups. Um, I think when we understand a child's temperament, and kind of some of those natural inclinations, it helps us really understand and interpret the behavior. And then, of course, the environmental influences. As we saw in the story with Teddy, the home environment, what was happening with his mom and his dad, what he was experiencing, that transition from first grade to fourth grade, was really, really very dramatic, and reflective of what was happening in Teddy's environment. And so we know that part of our jobs as educators, part of decoding behavior, is understanding what's happening with our students outside of the classroom. Now, again, I want to fully acknowledge that for my educator colleagues, the teachers in the classroom, I know how challenging it is and what you're being asked to do. Yeah, I've worked in education for 37 years now. And so in no way do I want to portray that you are expected to know every aspect of your child's behavior, or of your students' lives. But if we're seeing concerns, if we're seeing things happening, this is where we need to try to dig a little bit deeper, to look at some of these influences on what's really happening with our kids. Now, at some point in time, quite honestly, all kids, my 3 kids, your kids, will display behavioral issues at some point in their life. It's just part of being a kid. As I said before, it's part of those developmental challenges oftentimes that kids are going through. And this is true of kids that have some type of, whether it be an educational disability or some other type of disability, or their non-disabled peers that are out there. But what we really want to do is set a goal to understand the behavior, and not always react to that behavior immediately. Because behavior is always going to be some type of communication. They're always trying to tell us something through their behavior. That's a critical piece. Behavior is a form of communication. If you leave with one of the key talking points for tonight, teaching points for today, it's behavior is always some type of communication, that kids are trying to tell us something that's going on in their life. Now, sometimes, difficult behavior is a way of letting them know that something's happening in their life. And it could be a positive thing. Sometimes, I've seen kids come in and they're all over the place in the classroom on Monday morning, and they just can't settle down, and they're just, distracting to their peers and not listening to the teacher. And you find out that they had this wonderful weekend, a family party, and they were all excited because they saw their cousins that they hadn't seen in over 2 years. So sometimes it can be a positive, but other times it can be a negative. Something negative happened in that child's life. And so it's not always pleasant, but that communication becomes an important key to it. But once again, I need to remind you, their actions are not about you. It's not a reflection upon you. It's not something that they're trying to do personally to you. More times than not, it's really about what's happening with them and what are they really trying to communicate. Now, when we talk about decoding behavior, trying to understand behavior, there are essentially what we call 4 functions of behavior. Now, again, this is another area that we could dive pretty deep into. This is all about applied behavior analysis and truly understanding behaviors. And we'll save that for another day. But I do want to talk about each one of these areas just real briefly, because by trying to understand what is the function of behavior, and this is behavior in general, we're not just talking about distressed behavior or negative behaviors. We're talking about kids' behavior in general. Oftentimes we understand, well, what are they really trying to do with that behavior? What's really that function behind the behavior? In fact, there's a great meme out there where it says, everything is fun and games until you figure out the function of the behavior. And so it really goes to the fact that, with kids, at times it's real challenging, but when we figure out the function of it, we're like, oh, okay, now I see what you're trying to do here, what's really going on here. So we use the acronym EATS: escape, attention, tangible gains, and sensory needs. And let's real briefly take a look at, went back too far. Let's take a quick look at each one of these areas. So E stands for escape. And some students' behavior is really meant to try to help them avoid a task, a demand, or a situation, or even a person at times that they find difficult. And so the function of the behavior is really to escape that stressful situation. Now, a lot of times that behavior is inappropriate. It is, some type of disturbing behavior, or just destructive behavior that can happen in the classroom. But it's really meant to avoid a situation. And so, we think about Jamie, who's in the 3rd grade, who's really struggling with reading. And she doesn't want to take her books out in class during silent reading. She clears her desks, kind of throws them on the floor, calls the teacher a name. And the teacher just gets so frustrated, says, Jamie, go to the office. You go to the office. At home, what we see happening with Jamie is that she's refusing to do her reading homework. She's kind of lashing out at mom, who's not understanding exactly what's going on. Well, if we look at what's happening with Jamie's behavior, what is she really trying to communicate to us? Is she trying to communicate, I'm just a brat, I'm just a disruptive kid, who wants to be oppositional? Well, when we dig a little bit deeper, what we're finding is that Jamie is engaging in these behaviors to escape a situation that she doesn't feel good about, that she finds stressful. She's struggling with reading. She's struggling understanding and doing it. And so, I mean, quite honestly, if we think about our own behaviors and our own situations, how many times do we avoid situations that just make us feel uncomfortable or that are unpleasant to us that we don't want to do? As adults, you know what? That's actually a pretty productive type of behavior. We have that ability to do that. Sometimes kids don't have that ability to engage in the escape behavior. There are other times where kids will engage in more attention. They're trying to gain attention to resolve a concern or resolve issues. Now, I want to be really, really careful here. When I talk about attention, oftentimes the old adage is, well, don't give them the attention. That's just going to reinforce the behavior. That's just going to tell them that they can continue to do that and we'll continue to respond to that. Now, yes, that is true for certain behaviors. There are certain circumstances where we want to ignore the behavior so that we don't reinforce it. But this is where the decoding comes into play here. This is where our understanding, that playing the detective and really understanding, well, what are they doing? What are they trying to gain attention for? And is it something that we should ignore? Or is it something that maybe we really need to be responding to because it's communicating? Once again, behaviors communication is communicating to us that something else is going on there. So we think about Stevie. Stevie's a fifth grade student, and he could be one of these kids who's kind of clingy, who likes to kind of just be around and seems to need a lot of attention. He really wants to show you how hard he's working in class, and he raises his hand over and over again. He's always that kid who wants to have that recognition from the teacher. At home, he's constantly seeking that attention from his parents, kind of wanting them to review his progress and show them how hard he's working at it. What is Stevie really trying to tell us? What's really going on with him? And it's really this sense of insecurity, the sense of needing that approval, that sense of wanting to be told, yes, you're right, you're doing this well. By ignoring Stevie, by ignoring that attention-getting behavior, what we're doing is we're just adding to his sense of insecurity. We're adding to his sense of doubt that he has in himself. And so being able to respond slightly different to that type of attention-getting behavior becomes important. Tangible gains, sometimes the kids will engage in behaviors so they can get what they want. And oftentimes they'll engage in positive behaviors, kind of working hard so that they can get rewards, things of that nature. But other times kids will ignore rules, will not listen to the teacher, will not listen to a parent because they simply want to get what they want. And so, we think about, little Joey, who often will talk back, and his talking back is this sense of kind of being disrespectful. And we're looking at it like, hey, hold on, Joey, like, I'm the adult here. Let's be respectful here. And he ignores you at times, or gets agitated when you're telling him to stop, likes to argue, back and forth. Well, we could look at Joey as kind of, again, one of these oppositional, defiant type of kids and say he's, pain in the neck. But what is his behavior really communicating to us? Does Joey have the skills to really communicate in a different way? And so reading Joey's behavior gives us an avenue to some type of support or intervention that he may need. And then finally, the sensory needs. Kids, particularly younger kids, again, we talked about it earlier, our infants and toddlers and even our preschoolers are taking in things in a sensory way. Well, even as we get older, we experience our world by taking in our environment in a sensory way. For some kids, quite honestly, that sensory input can be problematic. It could be overstimulating or at times even understimulating. And so their behavior is more reflective of what's happening on a sensory level for them. And so again, we think about Esther, has a problem standing in line, at school. She kind of feels crowded. She feels, she's got to have her space. And so she's pushing, her peers away, literally moving away from other kids because she needs that personal space. Esther may really be experiencing that sense of feeling overwhelmed by that sense of being close, that sensory input that she's really getting from her environment happening around her. So again, I'm not asking you to really be a behavior analyst. There are folks out there, school psychologists, behavior analysts who can help you really understand the function of behavior. But I do want you to have a sense on that there are reasons, there are functions to our kids' behavior. Keeping this in perspective really allows us to address the roots of behavior and finding or helping them find different ways to cope with what's going on around them. So let's now kind of look more finally at some of the warning signs. What are some of the things you may see in the classroom? What are some of the things you might see at home that are early warning signs for distressed behavior and what's going on? And again, I'm going to take you through these in a developmental level because, as I had said earlier, it's really critical for us to look at children's behavior through a developmental lens because it's going to look differently, quite honestly, again, at these different levels. And so if you look at our younger children, 4 to 7, those preschools to early school type of ages, when we see kids who are feeling some type of stress or in distress in some way, oftentimes we see a regression in their behavior. We see kind of behaviors that may be more typical of even younger children than they're chronologically at that point in time. We might see a reappearance of behaviors that had kind of disappeared. Again, things that may have been very appropriate for a younger child to engage in, such as sucking their thumb or having toileting accidents, things of that nature. We might see these signs of regression. These are warning signs. These are signs for us to pick up on, to say, what's really going on with this child? Now, at this age, because they don't necessarily have vocabulary, we call it the feelings vocabulary or the emotional vocabulary, oftentimes that emotional stress is going to come out in physical ways. It's going to come out through their behavior. And as I had mentioned earlier, this is oftentimes where I'm having the conversation with the parents or with my teacher colleagues, about playing that detective. They'll come to me and say, "Yeah, John, he's just doing these behaviors, and I haven't seen those in a couple of years. I don't know what's really going on." And it's oftentimes at that point I'll say, "Okay, well let's kind of dig a little bit deeper. Let's try and figure out what's going on because these are potential warning signs of something happening there with the child." So as they get older, the term stress is not familiar for younger kids. It's not where they're going to say to you, "Well, I'm feeling stressed today, and I need some help with my stress levels today." No, they're often going to develop their feelings vocabulary a little bit more, and so they might talk about being worried or confused, angry, and annoyed. So these are terms we might start to hear from kids. They're going to start to verbalize a little bit more, but still oftentimes it's that behavior that we're going to see the warning signs develop for kids in this level. Now, it is interesting because they have a little bit greater control, especially as we get into the upper, 9, 10-year-old range, where they're starting to develop a little bit more control over their behavior. And so sometimes we see behaviors that may not necessarily come out at home, but will come out in school. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment, about for some kids, we see behaviors coming out because that's a safe place for them. Stop and think about that for a moment. We're going to stop and pause again in just a moment to think a little about that. But sometimes we see behaviors that may not necessarily be expressed at home really coming out in that school setting. So as we start to get, the upper ages of our childhood and into our teenage years, those glorious, glorious middle school years that we see with our kids, um, you know, this is a unique age. I quite honestly, I primarily worked at the high school for my career. I did some work when I was living and working in St. Croix at the younger age level, at elementary level, and I did some work at a kind of traditional junior high school as well in St. Croix. But I have to be honest with you, it's a unique developmental stage during these tween years or those middle school years that are often there. This is where we're going to see kids developmentally appropriate, but still could be a warning sign, avoidance that's happening. They're starting to kind of back away from us. They don't want to interact as much, but decreasing grades, not completing their work in school. These are some things that might begin to indicate there's something happening here. There's something going on. They're less likely to talk about their worries and their fears. So this is important. Just because you don't hear it as much doesn't necessarily mean that those concerns aren't there. And then our teenagers or our adolescents, as I had said earlier, the major life challenge or life task for teenagers is finding that sense of identity and autonomy. And that could be challenging in and of itself as we develop our own identities and develop our own sense of true independence, breaking away from our parents or adults in our life. This is where we're going to see behaviors that are much more what I'll term as adult like. They're starting to look more like those adult issues. Irritability, changes in our sleeping habits, breaking curfew or just not listening to rules that are out there. We might see signs of depression or anxiety that are happening out there. These are all potential warning signs. And quite honestly, it's one of those challenging areas because there are some, again, natural tendencies during teenage years to certainly back away, be less communicative with the adults in our life, not wanting to participate in family activities, things of that nature. A lot of that is, again, very normal adolescent behavior. It's when we start to see these more significant signs of stressors happening, that's when I think we need to start to pay attention. So this is, again, where I want to pause for just a moment, have you reflect on it. Imagine that school is the safe place for children. And this is where they feel safe to truly fall apart or let that frustration out, let those behaviors come about. And if they meet up against resistance, if they meet up against teacher or administrator, mental health professional or counselor who's not really understanding what's happening with that child, who's not taking that time to really understand what's going on, this is where things can really go awry. This is where things can really begin to fall apart for them. And I think it's important for us to stop and pause. Is this my student's safe place to be in my classroom, in my school? And so what might we see when we talk about these distressed behaviors? What might we be really looking at? So again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but I do want to give you kind of an overview of some of the kind of more classic type of distressed behaviors and what are some of the signs, what are things you might see that might indicate that in fact these behaviors or these issues are happening within the student's life itself. So when we look at anxiety, anxiety is actually one of the biggest areas, one of the most common, one of the most frequent areas that we see happening, not only with children and adolescents, but actually with adults. It's the number one area of mental health concern for all age groups that are out there. So it's fairly common, quite honestly. We probably all at some point in time have experienced some level of anxiety in our life. When we talk about an anxiety disorder and any of these quote unquote disorders, mental health disorders, we're really talking about not just the symptoms or having these feelings that are happening, but that it's causing significant disruption in our life. That's a really key thing. And again, I'm not asking anyone other than a mental health professional to engage in any type of diagnosis or diagnostic work. But I want you to understand that when we talk about mental health disorders, it's not just having these feelings or behaviors, it's that the feelings and behaviors are causing a significant disruption in our life. So let's talk about anxiety real briefly. Sometimes we might see kids in our classroom that are inattentive, that they're restless. And our immediate reaction is, oh, they have an attention deficit, or they just can't pay attention. They have ADHD. And I often get a teacher coming down and saying, John, she's just not paying attention. I don't know what's going on with her. She's just, must have ADHD. Well, you know what? Anxiety can cause us to have difficulty concentrating. Imagine a student sitting there so internally distracted by their anxiety, by the thoughts that they're having, by the worries that they're having, by the concerns that are going on in their life, that it becomes very challenging, if not impossible, to really focus and pay attention in the classroom. And so anxiety sometimes is more the reason behind that inattentive or restless behavior and not necessarily ADHD. Attendance problems or those clingy kids We talked about the example before, of it's not always kids who don't want to come to school because they're truant, because they want to be oppositional, or they just don't like school. No, they're really refusing to come or having challenges coming because they have significant anxiety in their life. School refusal is one of these major areas. And it's not because the kids don't want to be in school, it's because they're experiencing anxiety. Now, sometimes that anxiety is concerns about leaving home. So it may not be a stressor or some type of trigger that's happening in the school environment, but it's actually happening in the home environment. I've had kids who I've worked with at home who are afraid to leave home because they're afraid of what might happen if they leave. I remember a particular student, it's vivid in my mind. Unfortunately, that this young man I was working with at the high school level, he was a 10th grader at the time, and his dad was terminally ill. And I remember him saying to me finally one day, Dr. Kelly, I'm so afraid to leave because I'm afraid he'll die when I'm at school. And that just, for me, took me to a different place in terms of how I was looking at his behavior. It wasn't something he was trying to avoid in school. It wasn't work that he was struggling with. It was he was afraid to leave home because he was afraid his dad would pass away while he was at school. So when we look at attendance problems or clingy behavior, it really may be indicating some anxiety. Acting out is kind of, as we said earlier, kids are communicating through their behavior. And so sometimes it's that feeling of being out of control. Anxiety, again, if you've ever experienced it, it's this really disquieting feeling you have inside, and you feel very much out of control, particularly if you're at a high level of anxiety. And so this fight or flight mechanism kind of gets kicked in. And so sometimes that disruptive behavior, acting out behavior, is really much more reflective of anxiety that's going on. Now, kids, we have this kind of typical having trouble answering questions in the class. They don't want to, get up in front of the class. They don't want to make, presentations. They certainly don't want the teacher calling on them in class to answer something that's going on. And so, once again, if we have students that are displaying some of this, it may be more of an indicator of anxiety. The nurse, I love my nurse colleagues. I give them all the credit in the world, because oftentimes that's the first place that these types of things are going to start to show up. We affectionately, I mean this with true affection, we often refer to some of these kids as frequent flyers to the nurse's office. And these are kids who are often down there, and they're not down there because they're physically ill, but because they are struggling with some type of anxiety, something that's going on. Kids with anxiety often have difficulty socializing, working in groups, things of that nature. So let's move on to depression. These are kind of classic signs. Again, it's going to look a little bit different when kids are younger. The sadness, irritability, clinginess, aches and pains, refusing, to go to school itself. And it starts to look a little bit more adult-like as kids get older with depression. But all of these are those warning signs that something else is going on in the child's life. Something is happening in their life. ADHD is another big area, something that we see quite often. I'm going to be honest with you. It's often something that's misunderstood by educators. It's often something that we often look at as something that the child is doing. The reality is that ADHD, without getting into great details, what we call a neurobiological disorder. It's caused by our brain processing information, functioning in a different way. And again, I'm not going to get into great detail, but understand oftentimes this is not something that the child truly has control over. They're not misbehaving intentionally. So we know the classic signs of inattentive behavior. We know kind of what's going on, as though they're not paying attention, they have difficulty following, in class itself. We know the hyperactivity, their impulsive symptoms. So these are all fairly well known that we often see out there. But what we need to look at is that there are behaviors that are typical of students with ADHD. Those defiant emotional outbursts, are really because once again, it's neurobiological. They're having difficulty processing information happening around them. That impacts the behavior, their inability to truly process the information of what's going on around them. Making transitions become very difficult for them. We often talk about executive functioning and planning abilities, and challenges that ADHD children have, with executive functioning difficulties. These can all come directly from the ADHD itself. So as we come to kind of a close in our quick hour, and boy, these hours go by so quickly, I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts, and what do we really do? Now, some of you may be familiar with Dr. Bruce Perry's work. Dr. Perry is at the forefront of doing this work in the schools and really understanding kids' behavior and ways that we as educators can really respond. And I love his work around what he terms the 3 R's of reaching the learning brain. And essentially what Dr. Perry says in essence is that there's no way we can get a child in a position where they're ready to learn or open to learning while they are dysregulated, while they have something going on that's distracting, that's disturbing them. And so our first job as educators is to simply help the child regulate, help the child calm down, help them in terms of being able to stop, slow things down. And we do that through relationships. We do that through building relationships with our kids. Once we can get them to regulate, we have that relationship with them, then we can get to the 3rd R of reasoning, or finally reaching that learning brain. Now, what are we really talking about? Boy, it does take a lot of patience. It does take a lot of work at times on our ends here. And one of my core philosophies, and anyone who's heard me talk about this in the past has heard me say this before, but relationships are the basis of everything that we do in education. When we can build those positive, supportive relationships in that classroom, it allows us to address the behaviors. You see, without building those relationships before any of these behaviors even emerge, it's real difficult to do that in the moment. And so what I encourage my educator colleagues, my administrative colleagues, my mental health professional colleagues to really do is let's focus on building those relationships with our kids. Because when we need to address difficult situations or challenges, it's going to be that relationship that's going to allow you to do that. We've talked about getting to the root of the matter, really understanding. Remaining calm becomes important. There's a really famous saying out there that says a dysregulated adult can't help a dysregulated child calm down. Let me say that again. A dysregulated adult cannot help a dysregulated child calm down. And so we need to, at times, take a step back. We need, at times, to remove ourselves if we find ourselves emotionally caught up in a situation, because remaining calm becomes a critical piece in helping kids regulate. We do have to have a plan and thinking about how we're going to address this with kids, and so developing some type of plan, but being mindful of what doesn't work. And I think, quite honestly, what I see and sometimes where we struggle, I mean the collective we struggle, is engaging in power struggles with kids. I'm the adult, you're the child, you're going to listen. It doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. Now, there are times where I'm a full believer in authority, and there needs to be authority within a classroom, or within a school, within a home, and respect for that authority. But demanding respect is very different than earning the respect based upon the relationships that I was just talking about a moment ago. And so, I love this piece that's put out by Kids Minds Matter. And real simply, they talk about providing a safe, empathic, structured, age-appropriate, providing comfort, guidance for kids. This is what we're really called to do, is provide these elements that will allow us to understand the child's behavior. When we notice something going on, I love this term, notice out loud. And so if you notice something happening with one of the students, say so and name the feeling. Form it as an observation of what's happening. And so it's noticing out loud. It's very different to say, it seems like you're still mad about what happened at the park yesterday versus what happened now. Are you still upset about that? Very different ways to kind of approach the same behavior that we're seeing in children. These are common ways. I think any good teacher really knows this. Administrators, again, mental health professionals, using active listening. We know that active listening is a critical part of any communication. Not judging, lecturing, advising. Really trying to get at that big picture, understand big picture of what's happening here with the child. Reflecting back, kind of repeating back what's happening is a good technique for active listening. When we feel heard, and this is true of all people, when we feel heard and understood, we feel supported. Let's think about that. When we feel heard and understood, we feel supported. That's bottom line. And so that's what I'm calling you to do today, is try to help kids feel heard. Because when we need to reach out for help, and please let me say this very honestly. If you find a child's behavior is causing severe disruption in the classroom, reach out to those people in your school. Reach out to the school psychologist, behavior specialist, the counselor, the social worker, the nurse. Reach out to someone who can really help understand and develop those alternative methods. And so I want to kind of give you an opportunity here just to reflect upon what you have in your own schools. And yes, you can get out your phones now. I know you've all been really attentive and paying attention here and not looking at your phones, but get out your phones here, because you're going to, on the next slide, see a QR code that's going to come up. And it goes to a poll. And it's simply going to ask you to put in who in your school is a resource for you that you can go to and talk to about student concerns. So I'm going to avoid giving examples because I want you to think about that. But who in your school is available for you to go to talk about school students' behavior? So again, there's going to be a QR code that you're going to come out, and you could scan that. It'll take you right to the poll itself. Don't worry about downloading apps or anything like that. Just bypass all that and just you type in your answer there. And it's going to come up on a word cloud on our screen here. There is a web address that's going to be up in your upper left-hand corner. And my good friend George is actually going to put that in the chat. And so you'll be able to, if you don't want to use a QR code or type it in yourself, you could just click on the link within the chat. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to go ahead and access the poll itself. And we should see a word cloud starting to develop here very shortly. So I'll pause and allow you to access that information and then go from there. Excellent. We see some ones popping up here. School psychologist, counselor, interventionist, social worker. Excellent. Keep it coming. About a minute more. Mental health therapist, IEP teams. Love it. What I really see emerging here, and please continue to put in additional supports that you have here, but what we see emerging is that there are specialists, BCBA, the ABA specialist, excellent. These are folks within our school environment that in fact are there when that behavior becomes more than us just decoding it, more than us playing that detective within the schools itself. And so I want to thank you for certainly sharing all these resources. I'm going to leave it up here just for a quick couple more seconds, just to have you reflect upon that person within your school. Who can you go to? Who can you access if, in fact, you need additional supports that are there? So as we kind of draw to a close, I want to close with this one thought. It's really easy to label a child as bad and just move forward. Go on with our lesson, go on with our day, think about another administrative issue that's going on. But taking time to invest in that child, showing them love, support, through the good and bad, because we know those are going to come, and truly believing in them and their success can really create that long-lasting positive change in their life. It comes back to our beginning story about Teddy and the touching story of how one person believed in him and truly made a difference in his life. So I want to thank you so much. I do want to pause, check in with my friend George. I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen here and see if we have any questions that may have come up in the chat that in our relatively short time left, we can answer.
Just got a little bit of time here, but I want to start with a comment. I've got a bunch of questions. I don't know that we're going to have time to address them, but it's a comment and more of an expression of gratitude. You know, certainly for you, John, you've dedicated your life to helping these students. But I just absolutely love what you said about mission creep. And in a perfect world, our educators, they shouldn't have to focus on anything but instruction. But if we're really looking at the bigger picture and what the mission is, and acknowledging that we don't live in a perfect world, it's going to take a village to raise our kids and to get them educated and to make our world better. I think your video about, is it John Stoddard, illustrated this perfectly. And we've talked about this before individually, but you know, it's a sad state of affairs, but the truth of the matter is our K-12 system has become the de facto mental health care system here in this country. And in a time of mental health crisis with our youth, I am, as a parent, as a citizen, I'm relieved that there are people like you that are spreading this message of helping kids, not just because they need it, but also because it does facilitate the learning process. And the truth of the matter is, I read recently that over 80% of the mental health supports and services that kids receive in this country are through our schools. And so I want to thank you and say God bless you and all of the people, all of the educators, the administrators, the clinicians that are doing this good work, because what we're doing is investing in our future. And our society is only going to be as good as the kids we raise. We're over time here. If anyone has any questions, I have other questions, but John, I don't want to steal time for you. Put them in here
certainly
in the
open
chat.
to any,
and if not,
we'll give a couple minutes for if people want to put a question into the chat. Absolutely. Just to quickly reflect upon what you just shared there, George, first, thank you. Very, very much appreciated. I know that those are heartfelt. It's not just you saying these words because they sound nice. And so I do appreciate what you said there. And the reality is that schools, whether we like it or not, have become the de facto mental health system for children across our country. More children do get services in the schools than they do in any other location, whether it be community or clinics or hospitals, things of that nature. And that's not to say that we need to do everything in the schools, but it's just a recognition and acknowledgement that is important. And to your point about the importance of this work, you know, I'm going to steal a line from our Surgeon General where he talked about there is no greater work, there is no greater challenge that we're currently facing than to address the mental health needs of our kids right now, because it truly is our future. And I think that for me just it motivates me, inspires me to continue the work that we do, and to honor the work of my teacher colleagues. And I mean that in all sincerity. I truly value and honor the work that's happening in the classroom. I honor the work that's happening, at the administrative level, because those are not easy jobs. Those are many, many challenges. And I think what we need to do is adopt this sense of being in this together and working together as a team, not asking one individual to do it on their own.
It's interesting. I'm a big believer in maybe it's because the world we live in is we consume information on a bite-sized level through our social media, when we get online and everything else. And one of the questions, I have several questions written down that we're not going to be able to get to, but one of the questions that I had was, what is the most critical hack a teacher can do that you're not seeing as much to drive student wellness, behavior, and support? It was interesting. You really answered it at the end of the presentation, and it really comes down to if people take nothing more away from this presentation than this one thing, is making the students feeling heard and making them feel supported.
Yep.
I think there's such a powerful thing. And so, you kind of answered the question I had, but for me, that's the biggest takeaway I take from this, not just working for a company that works in education, but also as a parent. I think I need that reminder, because it's so easy to lose your patience and
we do all that in the context of relationships. I'll say it one last time: relationships are the basis of everything that we do.
I love that. Well, let's conclude on that note. We do have just a few housekeeping items. And one of the things I want to remind all of you that are still there, Illuma, we're very dedicated to this mission with John, of supporting students' needs across all tiers in MTSS. This includes general health, mental health programming, IEP-based services. And specifically, I want to let all of you know, Illuma empowers you to reach every student by providing unparalleled mental health services. This includes universal needs assessments and consultation, mental health screening and psychoeducational assessment, school psych, counselors, social workers. There's a pervasive shortage out there. We'll help you identify social emotional competencies using strength-based approach. We'll help you collect data and develop targeted interventions. Of course, we have MTSS consultation, staff professional development, funding and grant writing, and caregiver support. We want to help you help your students, so we're here for you as you need us. If you have any questions or want to learn more, please come to Illuma.com. We are here for you, and we are here for your students. John, do we have any other slides there? If I could ask you to share the screen.
I believe it's just a thank you, quite honestly.
Thank you. Okay, no announcements for upcoming webinars. So go to Illuma.com/webinar to hear about our upcoming webinars. And please come back. We love having you here. Have a great day.
Thank you again, George. Appreciate everything.
John,